Would the clerk please call the roll?
I think they're going to need 2 minutes to get set up, right, Katie? Give her 2 minutes to get set up.
For the Aurora City Council for Monday, September 9, 2024 is called to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Kaufman.
Here.
Councilmember Bergen. Councilmember Bergen. Yes. Councilmember Coombs.
Present.
Councilmember Gardner.
Here.
Councilmember Hancock.
Here.
Councilmember Zirinsky.
Here.
Councilmember Lawson.
Here.
Councilmember Medina. Here. Councilmember Murillo.
Present.
Councilmember Sundberg. Is
He stepped out for just a second.
okay. Mayor Pro Tem Zabonic.
Here.
There's no mayor's update. Are there any issue updates? Seeing none, is there any objection to moving the consent calendar forward items 2A through 2C? Seeing no objection, the consent calendar will move forward to items 2A through 2C. Items for the Policy Committee, item number 3A, 2025 proposed rates and fees presentation. Elizabeth Gallardo, Water Pricing and Revenue Manager. But for the other, we do. Why are we waiting?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Elizabeth Gillitzer-Gallardo. I am the manager of pricing and revenue for Aurora Water, and I'm here to speak about the water and wastewater 2025 fees, rate, fee, and allocation adjustments. So to begin, we'll start with rates. So Aurora Water's policy is that infrastructure and services are covered through our rates and connection fees. Our rates are used to cover our operational and infrastructural costs, and they are set every year based on the cost of service, and that's hopefully to lessen the impact of rate increases for customers. Our connection fees are there to cover any growth-related projects, and they are also reviewed annually as well. So the driving cost for the rate increases we are seeing is that we see an inflation of material costs associated with our operating and our capital projects. One big increase we're going to see here in 2025 is our Metro Water Recovery Rate, and Metro Water is our wholesaler for our wastewater and treatment. So they are projecting a 10% increase in 2025, another 10% increase in 2026, and then double digits in years beyond that. Also, with our capital projects, as you can see in the examples here, that some of our capital projects are actually covered and funded through our rates. So, with these increased costs that we have to cover, included are these operational increases, and these are just some examples. There, one big one we'd like to point out are chlorine costs. Since 2021, we've seen a 300% increase in the chlorine costs, and that's due to the closure of the OxyChem plant. So this just shows our proposed rate increases for 2025 through 2029. For 2025, we are proposing a 5% increase for water, 10% for sewer, and 3.5% for stormwater. 2026 through 2029, these are projections of our increases. They are subject to change just because we do that cost of service every year. We also like to point out too that we try to keep within the single digits for our rate increases, but because of the costs that we have to cover, as you can see with sewer, we're in the double digits. So these are our revenue requirements that are taken from our cost of service this year. So in the second column there, these are the revenues we're generating under our 2024 rates. The third column, these are the revenues that we would generate under our proposed rates that we need to cover operational costs. And then the fourth column just shows what we'd have to increase each class by to cover those costs. So overall, again, for water, we are looking at a 5% increase, and these are our monthly service charges at that increase for the different classes. Monthly service charge, again, is just a set fee that is billed to the different customer classes to cover the meter maintenance, reading, and billing of the accounts. As we said, 5% overall, but to break it down, residential, we're looking at 3%, commercial is 7%, multifamily will be 4%, and irrigation is 8%. At the top here, you can see is the Tier 1 rate increases, and then below that for the three classes is the Tier 2 rate increases, and we are proposing a higher rate increase for Tier 2. As we'll see later on in the PowerPoint, we are just trying to remedy an issue we are having with our allocation accounts, and so that's why we are increasing the Tier 2 rate to cover some of our costs associated with these customers. So for 2025 for residential, again, it's a 3% rate increase, and we are not looking at an increase in Tier 1 because we're still trying to promote affordability. We are seeing the increases across the other three tiers, and usually we put the burden on Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4 for rate increases, but that's to keep a separation of the rates. But we are noticing that it's harder to achieve that, so this will probably be the last year that we won't see an increase in residential Tier 1 rate. So this just shows the residential monthly water bill and the impact it has. This is including the service charges and volumetric rates. You can see in that first line, this is a Tier 1 customer, and the difference is truly just the monthly service charge, because again, there is no increase in that Tier 1 rate. And then as you go through the as the increase in usage, it creates an increase in the bill because we do put the burden on, or the larger impact on the high user customers. So for 2025, we are not looking at an increase for fire protection. We are looking at a 10% increase for hydrants. And as you can see there at the top is the monthly service charge for hydrants. And then below that is the volumetric charge. So before I move on to sewer and storm rates, is there any question about water rates?
Councilmember Bergen.
Yes, thank you. This came before Water Policy Committee as well, but just, I always get questions from constituents that do have the larger properties, larger yards, and of course they're thrown typically into not just Tier 2, but Tier 3, possibly 4. So on your average, I think it was like $241 or something like that. I have customers that are paying $400 a month for their water usage. So I assume that means they're in Tier 3, and I understand why we have to, cost this out for all the costs for bringing water to our city and so forth with the infrastructure. But I just want to put on the record that a lot of them do feel penalized when they bought properties decades ago with the larger properties, and obviously were told by their Metro District or their HOA they had to put turf in. And so they're feeling, the cost to maintain their yards is really hurting them in today's economic conditions. So just want to put that on the
Wonder if
record.
you could just briefly mention the incentives we have.
Oh, and they don't, the Zero Escape does not work for everybody. It's also very costly, even with the rebate programs. Just want to throw that out there.
Incentives.
Yeah, so Marshall, I don't know if you want to speak to.
Yeah, so we do, and we have tweaked our rebate incentives and programs recently to try to be more and more accommodating to some of the customers who felt limitations. This year, we are switching to a value per square foot of replacement, which will take away some of the limitations that have been there historically. So it does open up our rebate program a little more broadly to some of the larger properties. It still may not work for everybody, but it is more robust now and fairly aggressive. And so we're trying to continually work with them. Most customers that come talk to us find ways that it can actually be very helpful for them when they get into the conversation.
Yeah, can I just ask?
Councilmember Lawson.
Yeah, just a comment in general. So I understand that we need this, we need to do the water fees, increase them because of the infrastructure and everything. But right now, we're in some economic times, and then people who are in HOAs, like myself and other people, these costs go on to our HOA bills, which makes it raise. So is there any way, is there any thought in the future to maybe put a pause on this sometimes, or maybe where it could be a couple years? I'm not talking about now, but I think we've done that in the past, just due to the economics. A lot of people are losing their homes. A lot of people can't afford their HOA fees because this water, these increases in the water, because we're in a big property, we have to pay for that. So that's what I'm hearing from constituents. So I understand it's important, but right now we're in some economic times. And not eat $5, $20, I don't care. That means a lot to a lot of people in these economic times. So I'm asking, does it really have to be an every year thing? Because every time I see you, we're getting this to up the fees.
We intentionally bring these every year and try to keep them as small as possible. So I would love nothing more than to not have rate or fee increases. Our problem is all of our costs, and Elizabeth highlighted, chlorine by itself has gone up 300%. So we look for every efficiency we can, everything we can do to keep these costs as low as possible. But we're being burdened by cost increases. So could we pause for a year? The answer is yes. Would it be a good idea? Probably not. There is a city in the northwest.
Westminster.
And they're looking at a 50% rate increase.
Was that Westminster? That's another one. But Westminster, then they recall that. Mayor and I think some of the council
Broomfield's
members.
looking at a 50% rate increase this year. So Broomfield has done exactly what you were talking about. They've paused for a number of years. It caught up to them, and they're now proposing they've got to do a 50% rate increase. So most of those phone calls aren't going to the utility head, they're going to the elected officials saying, what in the world did you guys do, and how could we end up in this situation? So Broomfield's not alone in that. Westminster's had some challenges. There's cities in the east that are doing very similar things, or they're up in the significant double-digit increases, and we're trying to avoid that at all costs. So that's the downside of a pause, is not only would the 5% turn into 10% next year, it would compound on itself, and the increases get big very quickly. So we don't want to be like
Please proceed.
Thank you. So moving on to sewer and stormwater rates. So again, for sewer, we're looking at the 10% increase. And as you can see at the top there is the monthly service charges. Below that is the volumetric rate, which is in blue there. And then for stormwater, we're looking at 3.5% increase, which is at the bottom there. Again, some of the driving costs for sewer and storm, just repeating that metro water recovery rate increases are affecting us. The inflation in the capital projects and operating costs. And then again here, because some of our capital projects are funded through rates, so this just gives some examples there. So this just gives a comparison, this graph, of Aurora Water compared to other utilities in the metro area. Looking here, this yellow line represents the City of Aurora and our 2024 rates compared to other utilities and their 2024 rates. And then the red shows our 2025 rates compared to their 2024 rates and what we're proposing.
If I can, don't wear Broomfield. So it looks great today, but next year, again, they're looking at a 50%. So we actually anticipate we're probably going to slide down a spot or two compared to peers.
And to add on to that, some other increases that we've heard of that are proposed by other utilities. ECCV is looking at a 22% increase. Greeley is a 13%. I think Boulder is at 8%. And then Colorado Springs is 6.5%. So that's why we're projecting that we're going to move down on this graph compared to their increases. So any other questions about rates before I move on to connection fees?
Questions?
Okay. So our connection fees are used because we want growth to pay for itself. So it is a one-time fee that is paid when a customer connects to the system, and it is paid paid at the time we issue a building permit for new construction. Aurora Water has probably one of the most sophisticated connection fees, and it includes these components here. So the water resource, source of supply, conveyance and storage, treatment and transmission, and then the transmission development piece of it. But we like to point out that 80% of our water connection fee is comprised of the water resource component and the source of supply. And on this next slide, this just shows a visual representation of what our water connection fees are comprised of. So in 2024, we looked at our multifamily water connection fee, and this was just based on feedback from council and developers last year. We analyzed multifamily usage data from 5 years. So 2018 to 2022 is the data we used. In this analysis, it showed us that we needed to reduce our multifamily gallons per day per unit to 118. And we are looking to transition that over the next 2 to 3 years. So the reason why we're seeing the reduction is because there's more water conservation efforts, newer technology, and more efficient fixtures. And then again, here we're just recapping what we did in 2024, did the study, and it came out that we needed to reduce the gallons per day per unit. So for that reduction in the GUD, for 2025, we're proposing an increase in the recoverable and non-recoverable water fee for residential, commercial, and irrigation. That will help keep the multifamily connection fee flat at the 2024 rate, and then we can transition the usage down to 118 GUD. Again, transitioning over the next 2 to 3 years. And also we will do a cost of service in 2025, which will help when we determine our 2026 fees. So this just gives an overview of what we're proposing for the connection fees for 2025 for water. This is showing that residential, commercial, and irrigation, showing the increases, and then multifamily is remaining constant for 2025, or remaining flat. This is our 2024 water connection fees for all the classes. And then this just gives an overview of our 2025 connection fees for water for all the different classes. One significant point on here is for commercial. So commercial will be based on a calculated usage for all commercial connection fees instead of an estimated usage in 2025. So for our sewer connection fee, approved last year by council, was to increase the sewer connection fee by 20% over 3 years. We are in the second year of that implementation, and this is what it looks like for our 2025 proposed fees. So in bold is 2025, and we just want to do a reminder too that in the financial impact of the sewer connection fees is minimal compared to like the water connection fees, and it's relatively smaller in comparison to the big scheme of things. So it looks high, but it's actually a small portion. So for stormwater connection fees, we have not increased our stormwater connection fees since 2019. So we are proposing a 5% increase, and this is to cover some of our bigger stormwater rehab projects that we have coming up in the next year. So this would increase the single-family attached and detached to 5 cents per square foot of lot size, and then commercial and multifamily would be 15 cents per square foot of impervious area. So before I move on to allocations, is there any questions over connection fees? Okay. So allocations is a set amount of water usage allowance that's assigned to specific properties, and that's based on a calculated annual demand. Billed usage is deducted from the allocated amount when it's billed each month. And we have two types of allocations, which are temporary and permanent. Our temporary allocations were originally set on a meter size based allocation, and they were resetting every January based on the previous 2-year usage average. This resulted in the 2-tier rate structure, so anything that's exceeding this allocation amount for these temporary allocations gets charged at that tier 2 rate, and currently that tier 2 rate is slightly higher than the tier 1 rate. So this is where we're seeing the problem, because it's not a full cost burden to these customers that go over allocation. We're not recovering enough to cover these costs of their usage on the system. So permanent allocations, these are accounts that are signed into an allocation agreement with Aurora Water, and they also, if they exceed their allocation amount, they get charged the tier 2 rate, but they also get charged a capital recovery surcharge. So this just kind of gives a snapshot. We have over 600 accounts with a permanent allocation. Again, they sign into the allocation agreement. They are subject to capital recovery charges. And these 600 accounts include commercial properties that are 2-inch meter size or greater since 2019, 1.5-inch or greater since 2023, and any new irrigation account since 2017. But as you can see, the majority of our accounts are in this temporary allocation category. So before 2023, these allocations again were based on meter size, and they recalculate every year to a 2-year usage average. They're subject to tier 2 rates if they go over their allocation, but the problem is that when they use more water each year, they're getting charged this slightly higher tier 2 rate, which doesn't cover the costs of the capacity on the system. And then they also get their allocation reset to a higher allocation amount in the next upcoming year because they use more water. So this does not promote water conservation efforts. So this just shows the different rates, so you can see them in comparison. So for tier 1, this is what temporary and permanent allocation customers are charged at if they're within their allocation amount. And then tier 2 is what the temporary and permanent accounts are charged at if they exceed their allocation amount. But as you can see, there's not much of a difference between the two rates. Then the third rate there is the capital recovery charge, and you can see there's a big difference even between tier 2 and the capital recovery charge, and this is only charged to our permanent allocation accounts. So this just this shows and illustrates our temporary high user allocations for some of our higher users for commercial, irrigation, and multifamily. And as you can see here, their usage goes up every year. And then they're charged at that lower tier 2 rate that's lower than the capital recovery surcharge, and then their allocation resets every year to a higher amount. So for these temporary allocation accounts, as of 2023, we stopped resetting the allocation amounts based on their 2-year average. We set them at their 2023 allocation amount, which is their 2021 and 2022 average usage. They don't have any more increases in their allocation, and they're still not subject to capital recovery. Also, what we found with this too, it still does not reflect the connection fee or the capacity buy-in. So in 2024, we left the temporary allocations amount at the frozen amount for 2023. And then we also performed a 5-year usage study from 2018 to 2022. And this is to determine the new allocation amounts that we would like to set in place for 2025. Also, new multifamily properties sign an allocation agreement based on, and they'll have a permanent allocation based on their connection fees that they pay. So we are looking at a 3-year implementation. So the first year, 2025, again, we would like to set these temporary allocation accounts to their 5-year average and use that as their permanent allocation going forward. Tier 2 rate, as you saw before, we would like to increase that rate. It's still not to the full capital recovery charge, but it will partially capture the costs of these increased demands. Also, we do have a communication plan to notify these customers of the new allocations and the rate increases, but also they're still not subject to capital recovery. So for our new properties, all multifamily, commercial, and irrigation properties will sign an allocation agreement with Aurora Water. They will receive a permanent water allocation based on their connection fees paid, and they will also still be subject to capital recovery fees or charges. In 2026, again, all the existing temporary allocation accounts will be at their new permanent allocation that will reset every year. A new 3rd tier rate structure will be implemented, which will partially capture the capital recovery charges, and also the tier 2 rate will increase. Any account that exceeds this their allocation will be subject to the tier 3 rate structure, and we will update city code accordingly to match this. New properties, they will be set with a water allocation based on their connection fees paid. They will be subject to an allocation agreement and to capital recovery charges. And then in 2026, we are looking at a cost of service study for water, sewer, and storm, which will help with the implementation in 2027. So for 2027, we will again implement the cost of service. We'll implement the full cost burden of the tier 3 rate structure, and then we will update city code to eliminate any allocation agreements. So that gives an overview of allocations and what our plan is. Is there any questions?
Any questions? Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Item number 5A, court-wide work study, workload study.
I think that's late. Oh, Mike? I'm sorry. Is that right? Well, I can 5 there. Okay, then. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, council members, thank you for inviting me to talk about this workload assessment study. I believe this is going to be the second time you've heard a presentation on this project, so I will try not to be too redundant with what you've already heard. We can move on. Just a little bit of a background. The National Center for State Courts, who I represent, has been doing this work for the last 30-plus years. In fact, we are the ones who pioneered this work. Other people are using our methodology, though we do most of the workload assessment studies across this country and in other states as well. Personally, I've been doing this work for over 19 years with the center and have led some 70-plus workload assessment studies. You can move on. So for the current study with the Aurora Municipal Courts, we did a workload assessment study including the 4 groups, primary groups that you see there: judges, prosecutors and their support staff, public defenders and their support staff, and the case processing staff. So for this project, basically, we work with advisory committees or representatives of each of those groups. The first step is to meet with each of those 4 groups, identify all of the components of the study. We then trained everybody on how to track their time and enter it into a proprietary system that's safe and impenetrable. And then we also collected some quantitative pieces of data, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We analyzed the data. We came back and met with each of those groups, reviewed the findings, gave them an opportunity to do some quality adjustments, which we'll also talk about in a bit. And then we provided a final report in, I believe it was May of this year. Okay. So just a quick question about why do workload assessment studies versus just looking at the number of cases. One of the things that we've heard across the country, certainly since the pandemic, is that case filings are going down in many areas. There are certain areas where they are increasing. But if you can see from the first column there, you'll see the number of filings and then the percentage that they represent. So for example, in Aurora municipal courts, 71% of the filings represent traffic citations, but if you look at the next 3 or 4 columns over there for each of the study groups, only the high of 10%, in that case judges' time, is associated with traffic cases. If you look at the flip side of the domestic violence cases, they represent 5% of the cases filed, but somewhere between 15 and 30% of the work. So the idea is that a weighted caseload study allows you to determine how long a case takes on average to process, so that you can forecast how much work is expected to be done by each of those different categories of folks, and then also how many people you need to do that work. Okay, we can move on. For the public defenders, we worked with case closures instead of case filings because that's the way their system is set up. We used an entire year's worth of data for them, but the same issue holds true here. Again, looking at domestic violence cases, they represented 35% of case closures in this case, not filings, and represented 51 and 47% of the work, depending on whether it was the support staff or the public defenders. And you can see how the other groups work with that as well. Okay. So we collected quantitative data. This time study, it was 9 weeks. There was a miscommunication, I will own up to it on my part, with Judge Day. I let him off a week early. So we had 8 weeks of data from the judges and 9 weeks from the other study groups. As I did mention, the public defenders have their own case management system where it's set up to track what they do and on what kind of cases they work on. So we had a full year's worth of data for them. Everybody that was expected to participate in the time study did for the full 8 or 9 weeks, which provided really good data for us. We then analyzed the data to compute case weights or average case processing times, and then ultimately those case weights are multiplied by the number of cases either filed or terminated to get, again, that average amount of work that you would expect for each of those study groups. We can move on. So just a quick description of what a case weight is and how we get it. So during that 8 or 9 week time study period, or the full year worth of data from the public defenders, we look at each of those different case types, and we take all of the data that was entered, for example, from the prosecuting attorneys. We then annualize that up to represent a year's worth of time, and in this study, we agreed that most of the attorneys and the judges all had a 215-day work year. So we annualized that 8 or 9 week time up to a 215-year or 215-day average of work. Then we simply divide that by the number of cases filed, or in the case of the public defenders, the number of cases that were terminated. And that gives us a case weight. So in this little example, where it starts out with 6,160 minutes, that was entered during the time study. When you annualize that, it goes up to 69,705, and we come out with an average case processing time of just over 182 minutes. So when I say case weight, that's what I mean by a case weight. Okay, we can move on. We also collected some qualitative data in the form of a survey, and we did focus groups. So we did focus groups a little bit earlier than we normally do in our time studies. We did those in August of 2023. The time study actually took place between September and November. And then after the time study in October, or actually in about the middle of the time study, we did an adequacy of time survey. Both of those efforts sort of look at similar kinds of data, but trying to get a sense of what are the working conditions, what is the stress level, what are the concerns, what are the obstacles to getting work done. That information, paired with the information that we get for how long it currently does take to process cases, help us to determine at the end of the study whether we need to make any kinds of adjustments for quality. So the time study tells us how long it currently takes people to do this work. It says nothing about whether people feel like they can adequately get their work done and can attend to all of the elements of the work that they should be doing, or are they cutting corners? So this qualitative data then helps us to look at that and see if we need to make any kind of adjustments. Okay? So the qualitative, I'm going to have to come around here and just read a little bit because I don't have notes that are big enough. So the qualitative data gave us some information that I don't think any of you will be surprised at. Again, remember that this information was collected between August and October of 2023, and so a lot has changed since then. The very first thing was that time study period did, in the people who responded, represent a relatively typical period of work that's done in the Aurora Municipal Court. So that's always good. We don't like to hear that it was really atypical because of something very weird that happened or some new system that was going on. The things that we did hear, though, that provide some obstacles or some concerns, inconsistent case management systems that cause processing delays. We heard a lot of talk about people having to run around the court, look for a file because a case was called and they didn't know where the file was. I hope some of that's being fixed now because I know some case management systems have been put in place, but that was an obstacle at that point. Outdated technology and poor internet connection also created problems. We heard people say that they had to come all the way to the first floor in a certain place in the first floor of the courthouse to actually use their cell phones to make telephone calls. So that, again, when you're trying to reach clients or you're trying to reach litigants or other people to talk to can delay case processing. Definitely staffing shortages and inability to fill or retain people into positions creates a problem, particularly when you're talking about attorneys. It's hard to get them, it's hard to keep them, and when people do have them and they get trained, then they've been trained really well to go on to higher paying jobs. So that's a concern as well. We heard from a lot of people across the board that there's simply too much work to do in an 8-hour day, and particularly when you're talking about support staff, they're not supposed to work more than 8-hour days, and so they have to stop at that 8 hours and move on home, and then come back to their unfinished work the next day. The lack of case management systems, electronic case management systems, also prevented a lot of the attorneys from being able to go home and work from home because people don't want to, for obvious reasons, take case files home because they can get lost, they get lose pieces to them, et cetera. So lots of delays in that regard. And then there were some recent could you go back one? Some recent legislative changes that have increased work, particularly with the VRA amendment, which I understand will no longer be an issue here when things change around the domestic violence case processing. And there were a couple of other legislative changes that impacted the work. And then just a final thing that I think is really important. The staff in every group that we talked to and had focus groups with and collected survey data from really had a lot of pride about the work that they do in the Aurora Municipal Courts and felt good about working for the Aurora Municipal Courts and really wanted to do an excellent job. And I think that's a really important thing to pass on to this group. Okay, now we can move on. Okay, so I mentioned that we give folks the opportunity to do adjustments to the case weights. So we met with the judges, they accepted all the case weights, said they made sense to them, didn't have any changes. Met with the public defenders, they said the same thing. Met with the public defender's staff, all of their case weights were the same as well. Prosecutor's staff did not want to change anything. Can we move on? And then when we met with the prosecutors, they did add some time, and again, that's for that VRA amendment. Both for domestic violence and non-domestic violence case types, there were certain kinds of notifications that they need to make to the victims, and even though they have victim witness liaisons, there were many times that the prosecutors had to relay specific information to the victims, and so they needed to talk to them about something very specific. So they added some time to those two case types for that. The victim witness staff also added some time. Could you go back to the next one?
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Nope, one more. There we go. Added some time for VRA work, and then the case management staff added also time. They had a few things that they had to add time for. One was there were certain kinds of cases, I think they were the dog barking and the parks and rec cases that tend to be filed and dealt with more in the summertime. And since we collected the data in the fall, those cases didn't make it in quite as much. So they added some time there because they felt that the cases take a little bit longer to process than what we were able to capture in our study. There was some work with vertical prosecution that was just beginning that they felt that they needed to add some additional time with as well. There are some changes in the processing of warrants where the Aurora Police Department used to do that work or used to bring them over and hand them to Division 8 folks. Now the case management staff is doing that, so they added some time for that. and then also so for the in-custody changes and going paperless. So they increased their case weights a slight bit for all of those reasons. Okay, now we can move on. All right, so we talked about the case weights, we've talked about the impact that goes, the information that went into maybe making some adjustments. So the last piece is really to develop models around need. So what we need to do that are these three elements, the accurate case filings or closure counts, which we have, the case weights, which we created in this study, and then the year and day values, which I mentioned was 215 days for judges, prosecutors, and public defenders, and it was slightly less for the case processing staff, and I think it was maybe around 210 days for them. What that does is it takes into account allowing folks to be able to take vacation, sick leave, accounts for holidays, and some training time as well. That's what that looks like. So we deal in minutes when we deal in case weight. So when you boil down a 215-day working day for a 7.5-hour case-specific day, you deal with 96,750 minutes of work per year in a 215-day year. Okay, can you move on? So basically, then, to develop a needs model, you're just simply doing easy math at this point, where you take each case type, filings times the case weight in minutes, and that tells you the expected workload. So 1,000 cases at 250 minutes results in 240,000 minutes of casework. Add that to the case type B and the case type C, so 4,500 cases becomes 480,000 minutes of expected work. And then again, 97,000 minutes, or almost 98,000 would be one person's work here. So that's going to represent something like 5 people, the need for 5 people. Okay, last slide. So this is the ultimate need that came out from this model. And by the way, the model can be updated each year with new filings and or disposition numbers. 2 things I'd like you to draw your attention to. So the first column there, that FTE demand, or the first column of numbers, is the number of staff needed in each of those categories. The last column is workload per FTE. So basically what that's saying is the judges, you currently have 7 full-time positions. This model shows the need for 9.3. So right now, and I do know that you've got some additional support staff on a temporary basis, or judge staff on a temporary basis, but each judge is working at about a 1.3 FTE based on this model. Obviously, the prosecutors are in the worst space here. They have 14, they need just over 24, so they're working at about a 1.7 FTE per prosecutor. Prosecutor staff's working at about 1.5, public defenders working at a 1.3. I know you have a lot on your calendar, so I wanted to be quick. This is all I have. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Questions? Councilmember Hancock.
Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor.
Does that include domestic violence? Is that with or without?
That is with domestic violence, and that's a great, great question. When you drop the prosecution of domestic violence cases, it's going to change everything. Because we were working with people who had full caseloads, including domestic violence. You take those domestic violence caseloads away, and what that's going to do is allow those prosecutors and all of that case management staff more time to work on the cases that they have in front of them. You're not going to know what the full impact of that is until probably a year or year and a half after those cases are completely out of your system. There are some ways that you can go back and address some of that, one being what we call a Delphi, or you do some expert assessment around that to see how things have changed. But yes, things will definitely change with that.
Councilmember Combs?
Thank you, Mayor. So you noted that there were a lot of different impacts from the time that folks are spending, the technology issues, all of those things. How might those impact, and this goes back to the conversation we had when this study was very first commissioned, how might those impact dismissal rates, all those different factors that are affecting workload?
Yeah. That's another good question, and I will have to say that I will have to speculate here, because looking at potential outcomes of workload is not something that we do. But I think it's not a big leap to say that when there are big obstacles in terms of time, in terms of just finding case files, not having the technology to have an adequate case management system that's available to everybody, when you don't have enough staff to prosecute or to defend the clients and the victims that are in front of you, it's going to impact dismissal rates most likely. It's going to impact, I hate to say it, but probably even the quality of representation if you don't have enough staff to attend to all the components that are needed.
Further questions?
Mayor, can I ask another
proceed.
question?
Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Shoot, and now, of course, I've forgotten what I was going to say. All right, looking at the departments that participated for the court administration, it looks like it was really just the case processing staff. So probation, marshals, other departments are not represented. Was that a choice that NCSC made, a choice that staff made? Where did the elimination of the departments come from in the process?
The original request I received was only for the 4 study groups that were included in our study.
Okay, and so that, I have just a little bit of a follow-up on that then. There are, in some cases, probation revocation hearings included in the cases, and in some cases that's not broken out as a separate case type. Was that intentional? And then in addition, were there any other changes in case types that were evaluated over the course of the process?
No, so when we met with each group at the beginning and identified all of the activities and the case types we would look at, that's how each group identified their own. Julie, I'm going to have to ask you, were the probation revocations just incorporated into your misdemeanor, your criminal case types?
Well, each case is either a domestic violence case or it isn't. So that's how.
So, but if there's a probation violation, it's included with the original case type?
Yes.
And public defenders have that in their case management, they have the probation violations separated out already. So that's why we looked at that separately for them.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Coombs. Councilmember Sundberg.
Speaking of technology, we implemented e-discovery, and has that created more efficiencies? Or is there still a learning curve with that? Is it fully learned?
From the city attorney's perspective, our case management system, yes, is implemented. It's still being, enhanced and built out. So there is additional training that goes on, but it's absolutely the case management system plus the e-discovery portion.
Created more efficiencies. So
Absolutely.
So these numbers would look different had we not implemented that?
Yes.
Possibly, yeah, quite a bit. Okay, thanks.
Further questions? Well, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
7A, interview and appointment schedule for Planning and Zoning Commission. Katie Rodriguez.
So the Planning and Zoning Commission has 3 upcoming vacancies as of December 31st, 2024. Staff's recommending the council to approve the provided interview and appointment schedule. And we have had interest from the 3 members, but they have not officially applied yet.
Councilmember Morgan.
Are we able to just reappoint these 3?
They haven't applied yet. They haven't reapplied. Yes, you can if they reapply.
Because, like, for example, Bob Ross, I mean, he just
appointed.
appointed not too long ago. Okay, thank you.
Further questions?
Yes, Mayor. So you will
Councilmember.
let them know that it's, or how does that happen?
We contacted the 3 members. They expressed interest in reapplying. They just haven't done so yet.
Okay.
And so as soon as they do, we can let council know and bring that forward to just reappoint.
Okay. Thank you, sorry, maybe I missed that.
When will you open the application process?
It is open right now.
It's open right now? And
Yes.
when will it close?
October 11th.
Okay, so what guidance are you seeking today?
Just to approve the appointment and interview schedule that we provided on October 11th. Once we close the submission for applications, we'll email council, let you know what applicants we got, and at that point, if you just want to move forward with reappointing, we can do that.
Okay, Councilmember Bergen.
So if they, the 3, do submit the application since they've shown an interest in reapplying, then we don't need to interview, right?
Well, that's
Correct.
up to
That's
us. I
up to
wouldn't
council.
Right.
interview, yeah.
Yeah, so after October 11th, once we give you all the applications, council can decide to move forward with reappointing instead of interviewing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Katie. Seeing no further business to speak.
Mayor, can I jump in
Oh,
just really quick?
Member Dent.
Along those lines, Katie, if you're with me, we had passed a ordinance resolution combination to change the composition of the Aurora Housing Authority. And I know that they sued over it, right? So I wanted to know, because in that resolution, that we were supposed to be appointing new members by the end of this year. And so I wanted to know, were they able to stop us from doing this, or are we moving forward?
It hasn't officially happened yet. We are still in pleadings. They petitioned the court for an order to stop that.
Right.
The court hasn't ruled on it yet because we're still arguing on paper back and forth. So at this point, it's kind of on hold. The advice from counsel on that one is not to proceed until further direction from the court.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, thank you, Katie. Meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene on the floor at 6:30.